Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. My name is Heather, and on this channel I like to walk a very fine line between a shopping addicted makeup monster and a responsible adult with a makeup hobby. Now I really enjoy eyeshadow singles, duochromes, multichromes, blush, highlight, lip gloss, basically everything except pressed glitter, and today we're going to be ranking all the palettes that I tried in June. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, stick with me. We're getting into it right now. So if you are curious about my current eye look, it's coming from the Longing palette. First impressions should be up or coming very soon. I need to get back on a more consistent filming schedule and editing schedule because my life has been straight shambles for about a month now. So before we jump into the 14 palettes that I tried this month, I do have two face palettes to talk about quick. The first is the Michaela Glamlight Highlighter Palette. This was the face palette I included in my monthly bundle. If you are not familiar with my project, this year I have a goal of trying all the palettes in my collection that I haven't gotten use out of so far, and in this particular month, the face palette that I included was this one. So I got a pretty decent amount of use out of these two as like inner corner highlights or going like above my crease in the inner third of my lid. This one definitely was just an inner third kind of color for me, but I do think they held up nicely. Obviously, I think this is limited edition and is probably out of stock at this point, so if you missed out on it, you're not missing too much. I mean, I think Glamlight will probably put out another blue and green highlighter at some point, so don't panic. But if you have it in your collection, it might be worth getting out to try. And then the other palette that I had for face this month was the AmyLoves highlighter and blush palette. So you have the two highlights and the two blushes. Personally, I think this blush is a bit light for me, so when I put it on, it definitely like stands out starkly against my skin tone. I do like kind of mixing these two together a little bit to sort of calm down the brightness and intensity of this shade. And then as far as the highlighters, I really like this one on the skin. I think it gives a very soft, like subtle highlight. This one is a little bit more sparkly, as you can see in the pan, so I tended to use that more for inner corner or like the lower third of my lash line rather than being my full highlight. When I put it on my face as a full highlight, it wasn't the end of the world. It just is a little bit more glittery than what I normally wear to like work. So that was this particular face palette. And I will tell you, this month was a whole lot of meh for me. Like, I found myself being very uninspired by makeup. I was not inspired by filming. I was not inspired by the looks I was putting together. So this was a really rough month for me. And I think the palette ranking definitely reflects that, because there was just a lot of stuff that I was like, this could be the bottom, this could be the bottom. So coming in at the very bottom is this Lisa Frank and Morphe palette, and I should have known better than to buy it, but the Lisa Frank nostalgia got me. When I used this palette, I went into some of the like blue shades, and I couldn't believe how poor quality they were. I was having a really hard time getting them to show up in a way that wasn't very patchy and hard to blend. I found myself getting very frustrated by this palette, and because of that, I did not feel the urge to go back into it again. So I think I've only used this once, and I used predominantly the blues. I think I dipped into the green too to try to save an eye look. But for me, this was patchy. This was not easy to blend. It was not very pigmented, so I found it very frustrating, and I think they put a lot more money into the collab payout part of it than they did the quality, so came in dead last. Just one above that was the Ccolor Pastel Garden palette, and this is a dupe for Natasha Denona's pastel palette, I believe, and I thought the colors in here were okay. I mainly stuck to some of the like lighter colored mattes because I felt like they complemented some of the other eye looks that I was using, and I don't think I could make a complete eye look out of this palette alone. As a complement to other palettes to sort of lighten up the edges of an eye look, I thought this worked pretty well, but again, that's a very limited utility for this particular palette, so it fell all the way to 13 for that reason. Coming in at number 12 is the DreamHaus Midnight Garden, and the reason why I put this so low is because I feel like it's hard to use this palette by itself to make eye looks, because the only deep shades you have are this navy blue, and you could sort of argue one of these browns maybe could be like a mid to deep shade, but everything in here is very kind of private label quality wise. The mattes were a little dry, and the shimmers, while they were pretty, were very like standard shimmers, and so I didn't feel like my look was very special at all when I finished putting together an eye look using this palette. So for me, this one kind of fell a little bit lower. because the quality was sort of more that like private label quality that you would expect. I'm hoping that as DreamHaus continues, if they continue, that they put out something that has a little bit more impressive quality to the metallics or duochromes in their palettes, because I think that would definitely be a bigger draw for me in the future. But this one came all the way to 12. Coming in at 11 was the Main Stage palette by LA Girl, and I really didn't use this one a whole lot either. I found it a bit challenging to work with, and I think some of that might be due to the age of this palette because it's been sitting in my collection for like 2 years. So I did use this matte shade, and I tried to use this metallic shade, and I went in here a couple times for the black shade. The black shade was like decent enough, but it wasn't terribly pigmented, so I found myself having to kind of dig into it in order to get it to look very intense on my eyes, which is not my preferred way to use makeup. Like, I would much rather something that has more pigment that I can go in lightly and kind of blend things out than having to like dig in aggressively and then try to get that onto my lids. So for me, this one fell a little bit lower just because it doesn't seem to have as high a quality as I was expecting. Then we have the Car Beauty Capricorn palette, and again, this is just a palette that I wasn't like super excited to use. I used the mattes in here a couple times and they were fine, but it just like every time I opened it, I kind of was like, I'll just use something else. So for me, this one ranked pretty low just because the color story just seemed a little bit too disjointed for me, and I had trouble making eye looks out of this and this alone. So it ended up being more of a complementary palette to other things, which meant I didn't really touch a lot of the shades in here. So it's not necessarily a quality issue so much as just my general level of interest, or lack thereof. Next up is the Klarity Safari palette, which came as a gift with purchase, I believe, in one of my orders from Black Friday, and it's fine. Again, I struggle with this color story because the mattes don't seem to go with the metallics very well unless you're doing like a one-to-one kind of thing, which is not necessarily the way that I do my makeup. So for me, it was a bit of a challenge to use this palette. I did use it as complements to other palettes when I was making eye looks, like using this sort of burgundy metallic, the sort of teal metallic, and the silvery white metallic. But again, I just wasn't making whole looks out of this eyeshadow palette, which made it rank a lot lower in my ranking for the month. Alright, then last in kind of this like super meh stack is the Hangin' in Hawaii palette from BH Cosmetics. This was after they were bought out, I believe, so I don't know if this formula is a little different from the original formula for the travel palettes. But this one, again, not my general color story, right? We know that. And the metallics in here are very like straightforward metallics. This one had a bit of a duochrome quality to it, which is why it got dug into more than anything else in the palette. And I did appreciate going into sort of these pink leaning mattes that were in here. So that's the bulk of what got used. I think you have a lot of very similar brown shades in here. You didn't need all of those brown shades. You don't need all three of these red shades, and they could have used that to make deeper shades. This shade, while it appears deep in the pan, is very light on the lid, and so I didn't feel like I could get very deep in terms of the tones in my eye look, so I ended up having to go into other palettes to get more impressive shimmers and to get deeper mattes. So for me, this one kind of fell to middle of the road because it's not necessarily a bad quality, it's just not enough for what I need. I think there's too many duplicate redundant shades in this palette. And we'll get into some that I was a little bit more excited about, the next being the Nomad Hudson Valley palette, and predominantly went into the greens and the sort of gray browns in here, and then I did dip a little bit into sort of these deeper shades here to try to deepen up other eye looks. I did also use metallics. I think I stuck mainly to these two metallics, and they're fine, but they're just not like super special metallics. They're not like duochrome really, they're just kind of sparkly. So overall, not necessarily my color story. There are some shades that I was interested in and they did work nicely on the lids, but it just wasn't my all-time favorite palette from them, so it fell kind of to the middle of the road. And then we have the Fantasy Cosmetica Warlock palette, and I definitely struggled putting this one together as well with the eye looks because I think the shades, again, you have the problem where you have like two shades that go together that don't really go with everything else, and so I sort of got stuck in that, and that's not how I prefer to do my makeup, with like one matte, one shimmer. So I ended up having to dip into this and dip into other things to kind of make my looks a little bit more well-rounded, and in that case, you know, the shades that I used out of here were very nice. I did enjoy using them, but it's frustrating to spend like almost $40 on a palette and not be able to make looks individually out of this palette. So fell kind of to the middle of the road just for that utility reason. Alright, and now we're getting into things that I actually kind of liked. The first of which was the MBA Cosmetics and Deandre Nicole collab palette. It looks like this. Now, when I was coming into this palette, I was definitely coming in for the duochromes and multi-chrome kind of shades that were in here, like these up here, this one, and these two. I didn't dig into these two at all, I don't think. The mattes in here are fine, but they still feel very private label. They're not very buttery in my opinion. They feel a little dry, and I just don't think they had as much pigment as what I was expecting. But I do tend to layer from like lighter to deeper, so I'm not sure if maybe if you started with the deeper shade, if it would actually come across looking that deep. But when I was trying to layer it up with this pink shade, it was almost non-apparent on my lids after I tried to put those two together. So for me, the mattes definitely needed some work, but the metallics were definitely the saving grace of this one. Alright, 4 more, you guys. And these are palettes that I actually like pretty much liked throughout the month this month. The next one is the Green Arrow inspired palette, and I like the duochrome and multi-chrome shades in here a lot. I think the mattes that they chose don't necessarily go with all of the metallics that are in here, so I found myself using mattes from other palettes and then putting them together with metallics and duochromes from this palette, because I felt like the mattes were a little bit limiting. Overall, I think my favorite shades were these two, the blue and then this iridescent taupey blue duochrome kind of shade. I think those are very, very pretty. I did like the greens as well. The pink I didn't get a whole lot of utility out of, and this blue-gray kind of golden shade I didn't get a lot of utility out of. But I think the duochrome, multi-chrome shades are definitely what saved this palette this month. And then coming in at number 3 is the BH Avocado Toast palette. I'm actually surprised that a drugstore palette made it up this high this month, because everything was just like not impressing me this month. But I did really like using this palette, and I came into it very frequently. This palette, compared to the Hangin' in Hawaii palette, I feel like you have a much better gradient of light to dark shades. The dark shades seem to actually have more pigment in them, so they actually blend it out to a deeper, smokier shade, which I personally appreciate quite a bit. And I thought the metallics that were in here were really pretty. They went on nicely, they blended together nicely, and they lasted all day, which is very important to me because I work long days. So overall, this was one of the palettes that I was really enjoying throughout the month, which, as you can tell, there weren't that many palettes I was enjoying, so this was a bright spot among the ranks here. And then number 2 and number 1 were palettes that I purchased this month and happened to be playing with this month, so they were not even originally in my bundle. But coming in at number 2 is the AmyLoves palette, and this one looks like this. Now, this is a beautiful kind of smoky palette, right? I have a couple of gripes with the mattes though, because I think while this matte has a bit of a blue undertone and these are more pure gray, all 3 of these on the lids look very similar in depth. So this palette would have really benefited from something that was much lighter and something that was much darker, because I feel like with these 3 you can't really go any deeper and you can't really go any lighter. I do like the blue matte that's in here, but again, it doesn't necessarily go with a lot of these pinks that are in here, in my humble opinion. And the brown and this shade, I just feel like we're a little bit out of place. So for me, it's a nice palette, but it's not necessarily always a solo palette, because there's stuff in here that I wish was just a little different to make this a little bit more well-rounded. But overall, I still really liked it, and I thought the duochromes and multi-chromes in this one were really nice. And then coming in at number 1, this was by far my favorite palette of the month. If you told me I could only pick one palette from the month of June to hang on to, this would be an easy decision for me, and it would be this palette here, which is the Fantasy Cosmetica Cradled in Ice palette. It looks like this. Beautiful blue, pink, kind of nude mauve shades for the mattes. I feel like you go light to deep in both categories, which I really appreciate. And then you have these beautiful like duochromes that you can work off of. Now I will say that these 2 shades are kind of similar, so I think they could have maybe used a slightly different metallic for one of those, or maybe had like a purple undertone or purple duochrome instead of blue for both of them. But that is a very, very minor nitpicky thing to say in a month where almost all of my palettes were generally just disappointing me. So overall, this was my number 1 pick by far. I would highly encourage you, if this is a color story that appeals to you, I would definitely put this on your wish list because it's a great quality. Alright, and with that said, that is everything for this video. I want to thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you go, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!